Friend, enemy, or frenemy? How do Indians view the rise of China and its implications for India's rise? Join the conversation on this important topic by taking the China Challenge survey. The survey has been put together by researchers at the Takshashila Institution. Answer our 10 simple questions and let your voice be heard in shaping India's policy towards China. For more details, log on to www.takshashila.org.in or you can click on the link and take the survey in the show notes. Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy, where today I'm joined by Ashwin Prasad, a research analyst from the high-tech geopolitics team. I'm Vanshika Saraf from the Indo-Pacific Studies program, and today we'll discuss public spending for the space sector in India. Hello, Ashwin, welcome. So let's get to it. Recently in the budget, we saw Nirmala Sitharaman announce an 1,000 crore venture capital fund for the space sector. What do you think about this announcement?
I was really happy to see this being announced, Vanshika, because it underlines how seriously the government is taking the country's space sector and how keen it is in supporting the companies, the fledgling space ecosystem we have in the country right now. I do have a few recommendations to make in this regard, but the continued consistent focus on space was a very encouraging thing to see. And it is also a good sign that the government is able to identify what the challenges are for a new space company trying to set up shop in India. And they are on the right track. And also the budget got on paper an 18% hike, but if not compared to the expenditures, but the revised budget estimates, it's not that big of a hike, but that also has been consistent. And so this consistency is a really happy trend that I am noticing, and I'm very happy about this.
Okay, talking about trends, just earlier this year, the government also revamped its FDI policy. So earlier, as I understand, the FDI was permitted only for operation of satellites through the government approval route. But now there is 100% FDI that is allowed in the space sector. How do you see this move by the government?
This was also yet another example of the government identifying the challenges of the space sector and trying to align policy in a way that can help solve this problem. The FDI reforms were again definitely a welcome move, and these are all, I would say, the same pieces of the puzzle. You have the government also supporting the space sector through a venture capital fund, and also they're helping these companies get foreign funding and foreign investors buying Indian equity in these certain sectors of the space sector. Specifically, the FDI reforms, they took a subsector within space related to satellites and launch vehicles and spaceports and satellite manufacturing and service provisions, and they have liberalized the thresholds of how much FDI can come in for each of these sectors. The spaceports and launch vehicles, they are capped at a 49% limit, which makes sense because they are very strategically more sensitive. But satellite manufacturing, satellite components manufacturing, these kind of things have received 74 and 100% FDI threshold. So that just means that a space company 100% of that space company registered in India can be owned, the equity of that company can be owned by foreign investors, which is a great way to bring in funds from all over the world into the Indian space sector. And it also means that the space companies in India now have to compete globally for their funds. They're just not trying to target investors in India, but they're trying to, convince investors across the globe to invest in them, which means they're effectively competing with other companies in the world. And that's a good, healthy competition for our companies to be in.
Right. Talking about funding, can you also highlight some of the different ways that the government can invest in the space sector, since we've already seen an opening for the private sector?
Yeah, that's a great question because space by inherently by nature is a dual use sector, and a lot of the applications that can be deployed for civilian use can also be used for the military. And because of this, there is going to be always a lot of regulatory barriers and strict supervision of space activities by companies and by the private sector and by all the other entities. So naturally, governments are a big customer for these space services, and so a country definitely benefits from having a strong ecosystem of both government agencies and private agencies acting in space domain. And so now that the question that you raise is how can the government support this ecosystem, and we have a good reason for the government also to support the ecosystem because it's a huge positive externality. We have benefits coming out of these activities to the military, to all the other civilian users like disaster management and agriculture and crop monitoring and water management and flood monitoring. A host of benefits that one can get from a strong space ecosystem, and the government must definitely, help this develop more. And the way I see it, it can broadly do so as an investor, which is what the government is trying to do with this move in the budget, or as a customer, where the government just becomes one of the many customers that the space sector has. It, albeit arguably the largest customer, but still a customer nonetheless, who's purchasing services, complete services from the companies in order to support them and also for its own use, because it is, after all, very useful. And it is my opinion that instead of this investor strategy that the government has come up with, they have set up 1,000 crore venture capital fund to invest in and buy minority stakes from Indian companies in a way to support them and to give them funding. As opposed to that, I think the government acting as a customer is a better strategy, and it is a better bang for the public buck to to get the best outcomes.
Right. So I'll pick up on two things. One, thank you for putting into perspective why it's important to invest in space. Because I think for our common listener, anyone would question why spend so much taxpayers' money on space, right? So it's you very rightly identified development areas like water management, mining, land use monitoring, which we as a country need to move forward. So thank you for putting that into perspective. You also mentioned how this 1,000 crore fund is essentially insufficient for developing the sector, right? And you mentioned how the government should not just be an investor, but a customer. Can you explain a bit more what you mean by being an anchor customer and how the government can go about it?
Yes, like you said, we are in sore need of the information we can get from space in order to implement better governance and just to improve quality of life of the average Indian in the country. I mean, you can point me to any geographical location or any person in the country, and there are a few regions where the space can definitely improve outcomes for this person. So there is a lot of potential here, and this potential is something that the government must exploit, because there are obviously a lot of non-governmental entities that can use this information as well. But since given the dual use nature of the space activities and the space information coming out of space, it is tricky, and it's not a easy market for to be created and to be allowed in the country. And so in that regard, government is a natural customer for these services, and the benefits from these services are also very dispersed. And when you have such a vastly dispersed beneficiary pool, the government is best suited to act as the customer to uh, publicly finance these activities and help those benefits be dispersed across the country. And we have always had space sector has always traditionally had the government be the customer across the globe and help develop the ecosystem. And it's also the most, it also stands to benefit the most because uh, military applications need space activities, and these activities can also be used for the civilian good as well. And the government can you know be a great customer in the sense that they can draft contracts and purchasing agreements with these companies in such a way that it encourages these companies in providing these services, and also helps fund these activities as they go along in the provision of these services. And they are going to both support as well as buy at the end of the day the services from these space companies. And the 1,000 crores that has been allotted is a good mode, is a good start, but the honest fact is it's a very small amount in the grand scale of space operations, because space sector is a fundamentally a really capital intensive sector, and a startup will burn through those 1,000 crores in a matter of setting up operations in the first year. And it's not and if the idea is to support a lot of startups, it is better that we use those funds to buy things. And the anchor, as an anchor customer, they can set up contract such a way that there are milestones, and at the end of each milestone a sum of the payment is released. So on one hand, the government is ensuring that the public funds are being spent productively, something is coming out of the spending, and also it is also supporting the companies. It's not that at the end of the day they're receiving the whole lump sum, but they're receiving it part by part, and that can sustain them. And this can help them in so many ways. It can stabilize the market for them, because it can be an uncertain market with few customers. It can stabilize cash flow and help them have a constant stream of funding. And it can ensure demand, because once you have a market with sustained demand for these services, a lot of the other things will naturally fall into place. So, for instance, you have uh, the government contract driving demand, and there are companies that are coming up to fulfill this demand. Then you'll automatically have the further upstream effects of, let's say, investors crowding in to fund these companies which win these contracts. So which ties in very well to the point we made about the FDI reforms. Since we have opened up the gates for foreign funding, we can just set up these contracts, and the companies can compete with each other. And the best companies which have the best capability and the best proposals will win these contracts, and they will also win investors and funding, which is in effect what the government is trying to do with the 1,000 crore fund. So instead of doing that by being at the different place of the value chain as a customer instead of an investor, they are in effect driving more investors to and encouraging more investments into the space sector. And that's overall positive outcome for all stakeholders in the ecosystem. So it's just that it also yields better outcomes on the whole, because we are funding outcomes here. We are not funding ideas. We are not betting on a company to succeed by giving them public funds. We are actually making sure that they put in the effort, they put in their own capital, and the risk is theirs in trying to succeed. And when they do, they get rewarded for it. So the incentives are better aligned for a success in this scenario with the government as a customer rather than as an investor.
So, when we're talking about the government as a customer, purchasing and enabling services from these private companies, can you give us an idea of how developed the private space sector is in India and what level of expertise they currently enjoy vis-a-vis the global market?
It is great that we actually have ecosystem in the country, and this is all because of the entrepreneurs that have stepped up and taken initiative in the sector, and also the government for starting to reform this sector a few years ago. And back in 2012, 2013, we probably had one or two startups, but today, 10 years later, we have over 200, which is a very encouraging trend to see. We also see a consistent increase in the amounts that these companies have raised and the funding that they have received, and the scale of their operations, which are all very encouraging trends to see. But the fact is, it is still a very nascent ecosystem. It is yet to develop. and it is going to develop, but it is not as developed as, let's say, the US, the Japanese, or even the Chinese ecosystems, and there is a long way to go. Among these 200 plus startups, I would say maybe a couple of dozen have progressed in their operations enough to have some serious capabilities, and they have attracted a lot of attention already. And so, considering the size of our startups, it makes sense that the 1,000 crore venture capital fund is just 1,000 crores because it's a start. But like I said, the 1,000 crores being spent to purchase services and enable these companies is better use of that money.
Right. So, Ashwin, I think everyone, if there's one thing they know about space today, is the company called SpaceX and how successful it has been. So, can you tell us how the American government and its rules and regulations enabled the private space sector to flourish, and what lessons we can draw from it, if there are any?
The US government's model of encouraging the private companies is a great learning case study for a lot of us in this space, and it's a very interesting trend. SpaceX specifically, this was during the early 2000s when the US government started to consider retiring the space shuttle. The space shuttle was this gigantic a rocket that was made to take payload as well as crew and cargo to the lower Earth orbit. This is not the middle Earth orbit, the geosynchronous orbit, or the moon or Mars. It is just the lower Earth orbit, and this because lower Earth orbit is something that we frequently visit. The International Space Station is there. A lot of satellites are there, and the US needed a vehicle, a shuttle to come to and fro from Earth to the lower Earth orbit, and this was the role that the space shuttle was fulfilling. And it was, but the issue was this was an old vehicle, and it was still planned for a lot more flights, but the costs were really high. It was done during the Nixon era, so it was not a young space shuttle. The technology was not young, and the costs were mounting. There were also safety concerns. We had a couple of tragic crashes where we lost some of the astronauts. So the government started to consider shutting the space shuttle program down, and uh, obviously they needed a replacement. At this juncture, what they did was they started something called the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services Program, the COTS program. And this was a way for the government to outsource this part of their space activity to the private sector, and it makes sense because NASA should be focusing its resources, its expertise, its scientists focus on really cutting edge space technological research and development, targeting Mars missions and moon missions and things like that. Lower Earth orbit is something that they had already mastered well. It was something they knew well to do, and there was no need for NASA to continue to work on launch vehicles and transportation services to this lower Earth orbit. And they started the COTS program, and then the COTS program incentivized private companies to develop capability to fly to the lower Earth orbit. And among the two major companies that came up as part of the COTS program, SpaceX was one of the big ones. And they finally demonstrated that they can take payloads to the lower Earth orbit in, I think, 2012. And soon the Dragon capsule even took the crew a few years later. And today they have a fleet of reusable launch vehicles, which are the cheapest in the world by far because of their reusability, and they are continuing to push the limits of how much payload you can take to orbit with their Starship. And they are a shining example of what a great private company can do for a country's space power. And it is a great example, and this is a great case study for India to adopt contractual processes where it can incentivize its companies to help the government in realizing this part of the space value chain, which is already well known. It is not the cutting edge, it is not pushing the boundaries of what is possible. I mean, obviously they can do that, but there is a lot more commercial viability in handling this kind of a space within the space sector. And yeah, that's how it went in the with SpaceX, and the COTS was like instrumental in helping SpaceX grow.
Right. So it was a crisis that gave birth to a very innovative public policy,
Yeah.
and which we see led to a very highly successful outcome, as you say. And we should focus our policies not to produce ideas, but outcomes, as you rightly pointed out in your op ed. So, do you think, Ashwin, that we are on that path to create a conducive environment where we can one day create a company like SpaceX, which is built in India, and have that, as you said, space for growth?
Yeah, we have started this undertaking of this journey of policy reform in the space sector starting from 2019, and there has been consistent developments over the last few years, and as every part of this sector is being gradually reformed, and the space activities bill is expected to come out in this governmental term. So that's something that we are all looking forward to, and we are uh, late to this reform, but we are still not so late that it's still a lot of optimism in this area, and we hopefully will start. Our companies will start growing, and we'll start having serious global capabilities in space. We have the smarts for it. We have the tools for it. We soon have the policy for it. If the policy reform stays consistently and the conversations keep going forward. And I don't know if we'll have a SpaceX because maybe our comparative advantage is with something downstream like satellite services or something else, but that remains to be seen. And I'm as curious as you in how all of this will unfold.
Thank you, Ashwin, so much for shedding light on something that seems to be dark for the general public. And I hope, as you said, we have the smarts, we have the tools, but now all we need is the policy to make sure that we can leverage all of those. Thank you for joining us for this All Things Policy episode. And see you again next week.
Thanks, Vanshika. This was a wonderful chat.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.